I never imagined I would reach this point. Standing on the edge of a line I swore I'd never cross. All my life I prided myself on my integrity, my faithfulness, my loyalty to the man I married. But somewhere along the way our marriage had dulled. Something warm and alive had withered into cold routines. I tried to deny it, to convince myself that marriage just naturally mellowed like that. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was missing something fundamental. And worse, so was he. For weeks, maybe even months, I felt his absence even when he was in the room. He was distracted, his attention perpetually somewhere else, on his phone, in his work, with friends. It felt as if my voice had lost any power to reach him. I could have screamed, thrown something across the room, but I doubted it would change anything. His eyes never sparked when he looked at me. They seemed hollow, like he was lost in his thoughts, completely disconnected from what we used to share. And then one night, a terrifying thought lodged itself in my mind. Maybe he no longer loved me. The idea gnawed at me, corroding every peaceful thought I tried to console myself with. I didn't want to lose him. I wanted him to feel something for me again. And so, in my desperation, I found myself wondering, what if he were jealous? What if he could see that other men found me attractive too? Would he remember what we had, what he was losing? I knew I was walking a dangerous line, but I couldn't shake the idea. Somewhere along the way I convinced myself that it might just work. That's when Daniel, a friend of ours, entered the picture. He was kind, warm, and naturally flirtatious in a way that had always made me a bit nervous, even though I'd never admitted it to myself. I decided to test my plan, subtly at first, just a few extra smiles, some gentle laughter at his jokes when we were all out together. I thought my husband might notice, maybe even pull me aside to ask what was going on. But he didn't. He barely looked up from his phone. Even when Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder or leaned in just a little closer than usual to talk to me, the first pangs of frustration took root inside me. Was I truly so invisible to him? So I took it a step further. The next time Daniel invited us to a group dinner, I wore my favorite black dress, the one that always used to make my husband stare. But his eyes were as distracted as ever, so when Daniel's gaze lingered on me, I let myself bask in it. I laughed with him, leaned into his words, let my fingers brush against his hand a little too often. There was an undeniable spark in Daniel's eyes that my husband either didn't see or didn't care enough to react to. I was starting to enjoy the attention more than I should, and that alone scared me. A week passed and things only escalated. Each time we saw Daniel, I felt a jolt of electricity that I hadn't felt in years. My husband's obliviousness fed my desire to keep pushing this boundary, to see what would happen if I let myself go further. Daniel seemed just as drawn to me, the stolen glances, the soft murmur of his voice when he spoke to me. I'd tell myself each time that it was harmless, that it was just a game to make my husband see me again. But it was becoming something else. One evening, Daniel invited us over to his place for drinks, but my husband canceled last minute. He told me to go without him, that he'd catch up on some work he'd fallen behind on. My heart raced as I drove over, feeling reckless, feeling strangely liberated. When I arrived, Daniel greeted me with that warm, lingering smile that made my knees weak. We talked, drank, and the chemistry between us was undeniable. I could feel the tension growing between us, thickening the air until I was dizzy. Then he reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from my face. My breath caught, and for a moment, the room felt suffocatingly quiet. I could have stopped it, pulled away, made some excuse and left. But I didn't. My mind told me I was doing this to provoke my husband, to remind him of what he was losing. But deep down I knew that was only part of it. I wanted this. I wanted to feel wanted, to feel seen. When Daniel kissed me, it shattered any lingering hesitation I'd held on to. I let myself give in, let myself feel everything I'd been denying for so long. The boundaries I'd clung to melted away. And in that moment it wasn't about my husband at all. It was about me, about reclaiming something I thought I'd lost long ago. I stayed with Daniel that night and for a while I felt alive again. Afterward, a mixture of emotions washed over me. Guilt, exhilaration, and a gnawing fear. I went home, lay next to my husband in our bed, and realized I felt no closer to him than before. I'd done this to make him see me, to make him feel jealousy, to want me again. But now I was the one who felt different. I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross, changed something inside me I couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, I waited for some sign that he'd notice, that he'd care. I waited for him to ask why I was distant, why I looked so different, but he didn't. He remained as oblivious as ever, and it tore at me. I thought he'd see, that he'd fight for me, but he was just as absent as always. It left me wondering if it was all worth it, if losing myself in this experiment was worth the fleeting satisfaction. When I looked in the mirror, I saw someone I didn't fully recognize. A woman who had chased her husband's love into the arms of another man. I thought I'd done it to fix us, to pull him back to me. But it was too late for that. I had crossed too many lines, felt too much. I couldn't undo what had happened, couldn't erase the parts of myself I'd revealed to Daniel. Nor could I forget the feeling of being truly wanted. I couldn't go back to the woman who had started this, the woman who thought a little jealousy could save a marriage. Maybe I'd failed to bring my husband closer, but I had found a part of myself I'd almost forgotten. Someone who was passionate, alive, and willing to risk everything to feel seen. And maybe that was worth something, even if it cost me the very relationship I'd been trying so desperately to save. After that night with Daniel, I felt like I was living two lives. In one, I was still the devoted wife, attending to the same daily routines, the same quiet dinners with my husband, who remained oblivious. In the other life, I felt like a woman reborn. A woman who was desired, who knew she could stir someone else's heart, make someone's pulse quicken with a single glance. But those two lives clashed within me, fighting to find some semblance of balance. Every day was a seesaw of emotions. I'd wake up beside my husband, aching for him to look at me the way Daniel did, to reach for me. But he'd just murmur a groggy good morning, without even opening his eyes. And I couldn't help but feel the sting of rejection. Yet every time I felt those pangs of hurt, my mind drifted back to Daniel, his touch, his whispered words. They filled the hollow spaces my husband's indifference left behind. A week later, Daniel texted me just a casual "hope you're doing well," that I knew had layers beneath it. Seeing his name pop up on my phone made my heart pound, even as I sat across from my husband at the dinner table. I felt the blush on my cheeks, the tiny thrill of a secret. My husband didn't even glance up from his plate as I excused myself and slipped into the kitchen to text Daniel back. Our conversation was light, casual even, but we both knew what lay between the lines. I could feel the tension through the screen, the unspoken things we wanted to say. Over the next few days, my phone became a lifeline to this hidden part of my life. Daniel and I would chat about everything, sometimes for hours, his messages sparking laughter that felt new and warm. He'd send a message in the middle of the night, and I'd check my phone under the blankets, feeling like a teenager with a crush. And I knew deep down that I was in dangerous territory, but it felt like there was no turning back. Every text, every call was a reminder that I wasn't invisible. One evening, as my husband worked late, Daniel asked me to meet him for a drink. It was innocent enough, but we both knew what we wanted. I hesitated, staring at the text as my heart raced. I knew what would happen if I went. I knew that I was standing on the edge of something that would forever change me. Something I could never explain away as just an attempt to save my marriage. But my fingers betrayed me, and before I knew it, I had typed out yes. The hours leading up to our meeting felt like a blur. I carefully chose my outfit, feeling a strange sense of guilt and excitement all at once. I told myself I was just going to talk to him, just to feel that warmth again, to remind myself that I was worth being seen. But as I applied my lipstick, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dressing up for a date. When I walked into the bar and saw Daniel waiting, his smile broke through any last slivers of hesitation. We talked, laughed, and as the night wore on, I felt myself inching closer to him, drawn to him in ways that felt magnetic. It was like we were the only two people in the room. I could tell he felt it too. His hand would brush against mine, his eyes lingering, his voice lowering with each sentence. And when he finally leaned in to kiss me, I didn't pull away. As our kiss deepened, the room and all my worries faded into nothing. I felt alive, vibrant, like every nerve ending was electric. I felt everything I'd been craving, everything I'd forgotten was even possible. I thought I'd feel guilty afterward, but all I felt was relief, a strange, liberating relief, as if I'd finally let go of everything that had been weighing me down. I knew I couldn't go back now. For the first time in years, I felt truly myself. Over the next few weeks, I found myself sneaking out to meet Daniel. Each time we met, it felt like the world shifted, like everything in my life made sense. I'd return home with a sense of guilt that quickly faded as soon as my husband's indifferent gaze met mine. Our conversations were minimal, our physical contact almost non-existent. I began to realize that my marriage had been withering for a long time, long before Daniel stepped into my life. At first, I told myself this affair was a temporary escape, that I'd end it as soon as my husband noticed, as soon as he showed even a glimmer of the love we used to share. But he never did. No matter what I did, no matter how much I tried to get his attention, he seemed content to stay in his own world. I began to wonder if he was happier with this silent distance between us, if maybe he too was just going through the motions. One night, as I lay awake beside him, the thought struck me like a cold splash of water. What if he didn't love me anymore? What if he was only staying because it was easier than leaving? I had clung to this idea that he'd come back to me, that this experiment of jealousy would reignite something between us. But now the truth felt devastatingly clear. I wasn't the center of his world anymore, and maybe I never would be again. The realization should have crushed me, but instead it felt like a release. For so long I'd been trying to save something that was beyond repair. And here was Daniel, a man who made me feel alive, wanted, who looked at me like I was the only woman in the world. I knew I couldn't keep living a lie, balancing between these two worlds, pretending I was happy in a marriage that had long since lost its warmth. The next day, I sat down with my husband, determined to tell him the truth. I'd rehearsed the words in my mind, but as I looked at him, they all faded away. He was tired, worn out, a version of the man I'd married but somehow emptier. I realized maybe he already knew. Maybe he'd seen the changes in me, the distance between us, and simply chosen not to confront it. With a heavy heart, I told him everything. I told him about my loneliness, my need to feel loved, how I'd sought that feeling elsewhere. I could see the hurt in his eyes, a deep sadness that seemed to mirror my own. But instead of anger, he simply nodded, almost as if he'd expected this outcome all along. In that moment, I knew we had both given up long ago. We had just been too afraid to admit it. Leaving was harder than I expected. There were moments I doubted my decision, moments where the pain of losing him felt unbearable. But I couldn't live in the shadow of a love that had faded. With Daniel, I'd found a part of myself I didn't even know I'd lost. I knew our relationship might not last forever, that we'd have our own challenges, but at least I was choosing something that made me feel alive. Now every day is a chance to start over, to embrace the woman I've become. The guilt has faded, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. I no longer regret the path I took. It led me to the truth about myself and what I needed to be happy. I didn't set out to hurt anyone, but sometimes the hardest choices are the ones that bring the most growth. I will carry those lessons with me, knowing that even if love changes, I am still worthy of it, and I am still capable of finding it, even in the most unexpected places. After my husband and I separated, the days felt like a strange blur, a mix of freedom and unease. I felt liberated from the weight of pretending everything was fine. Yet the emptiness of my home, the lack of his presence, even the sight of his toothbrush still left behind, reminded me of the life I'd left behind. I thought the ache would disappear once I made my choice, but as each day passed, I realized the process of detachment was gradual, much more difficult than I had imagined. Memories would creep up at unexpected moments, small and silly ones that I hadn't anticipated, and for a few seconds I'd feel myself wavering. I'd ask myself if I'd made the right choice, if I'd somehow mistaken thrill for something deeper. But each time those doubts came, so did Daniel. He was a constant, something stable and true in the shifting sands of my life. We started spending nearly every day together, though we tried to move slowly, aware that there was a lot of healing I still had to do. In those early weeks, he'd cook for me, bring me flowers, make me laugh with little things that felt like secret gifts. There was no judgment in his eyes, no impatience. He seemed to understand the turmoil that came with ending a marriage, and instead of trying to fill the silence, he let me process it in my own time. That perhaps was one of the things that drew me to him most deeply. I didn't feel like I had to be anything more or less than exactly who I was. One night, about a month after the separation, Daniel and I found ourselves on a long drive. The plan was to head to a small town nearby for dinner, but halfway there, a sudden rainstorm forced us to stop at a roadside inn. It was a quaint, almost forgotten place with creaky wooden floors and a fire crackling in the lobby. There was a simplicity about it, something that reminded me of how the best moments are often unplanned, unfolding in unexpected places. We spent that evening by the fire talking for hours about things we'd never touched on before. Our childhoods, our fears, our dreams. I confessed how long I'd felt unseen, how invisible I'd become in my own life without even realizing it. Daniel listened intently, never interrupting, his gaze steady and warm. He didn't offer solutions or advice. He simply allowed me to be vulnerable, to lay bare parts of myself I hadn't even admitted to myself. Somewhere in the middle of my rambling, I realized I'd been holding his hand, his fingers entwined with mine in a way that felt natural and comforting. I felt a deep sense of relief, a realization that I didn't have to pretend to be anything other than what I was. And in that simple, quiet connection, I understood that my heart had begun to trust again. Not just in him but in myself, in my ability to choose happiness. Over time our relationship continued to grow, evolving from the intense passion of our early days into something softer, steadier. We'd spend hours just talking or cooking together, filling the silence with laughter and small, meaningful moments that reminded me how fulfilling a real connection could be. He introduced me to parts of myself I'd long neglected, coaxing out laughter and joy that had once been buried under layers of obligation and resignation. But as the months rolled by, I began to notice a small nagging feeling creeping back in, one I thought I'd left behind. It was a subtle anxiety, a feeling that maybe I was unworthy of the love he was giving me, that perhaps I was tainted by the choices I'd made. I'd look at him sometimes and wonder if he too questioned my integrity, if somewhere in the back of his mind he thought, if she did it once, what's to stop her from doing it again? It was a fear I couldn't shake, something that gnawed at me even in our happiest moments. I tried to push the thought away, but it lingered, souring the sweetness of our relationship in small, unspoken ways. I would overanalyze the simplest moments, convinced that he was second-guessing me, questioning the sincerity of my love. And in that fear, I found myself becoming distant, withdrawing ever so slightly, as if by doing so I could protect myself from an inevitable heartbreak. One evening as we sat on the couch watching a movie, Daniel paused it and turned to me. I felt his gaze before I looked up, the weight of his attention cutting through the comfortable silence. "What's going on?" he asked gently, his voice soft but steady. I looked away, suddenly ashamed. The walls I'd worked so hard to break down had crept up again, and I didn't know how to let them fall. "It's nothing," I murmured, trying to brush it off, but he didn't let it go. He reached for my hand, and the warmth of his touch disarmed me. "You're pulling away," he said quietly, his eyes searching mine. "I can feel it. You don't have to do this alone." The word struck a chord deep within me, and before I could stop myself, everything spilled out. My fears, my insecurities, my lingering guilt over the choices I'd made. I told him about the fear of losing him, of not being worthy of a love as honest and true as his. And as I spoke, I felt the weight lift, the burden of hiding my doubts finally easing. He listened, never interrupting, his expression thoughtful and kind. When I finished, there was a long pause, and I feared he'd finally see me for the flawed, broken person I was. But instead he pulled me close, his voice steady as he said, "We all have scars, things we wish we could change. But you don't have to carry this guilt forever. We're both here now choosing each other. That's what matters." His words soothed something deep within me, dissolving the walls I'd built. For the first time I truly allowed myself to believe that I was worthy of love, that the mistakes of my past didn't have to define my future. I realized that Daniel wasn't my escape from a broken marriage. He was my chance at building something real, something that could withstand the trials of life, both beautiful and flawed. From that moment on, I committed myself to our relationship, letting go of the doubts and embracing the possibility of a future built on trust. And while I still had moments of uncertainty, they no longer held power over me. I had found someone who saw me, truly saw me, and loved me not in spite of my flaws but because of them. Now, as I look back on the journey that led me here, I see it as more than a tale of heartbreak or betrayal. It's a story of transformation, of rediscovering who I am and what I deserve. I know there will be challenges ahead, that love is not a constant state of bliss but a series of choices, a commitment renewed every day. And I am ready to face those challenges, to hold on to this love that has shown me the beauty of honesty and the power of forgiveness. For the first time in years, I am living a life of my own choosing. A life filled with laughter, hope, and a love that feels as real and unbreakable as the lessons I've learned. And in that life, I've found a version of myself that is stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever comes next. In the months that followed, my life took on a rhythm that was both foreign and comforting. Every day, I woke up next to Daniel with a feeling of peace, like I was finally settling into my own skin. The whirlwind of emotions that had once clouded my judgment had softened into a steady warmth, a trust one hadn't known I could feel. But life, of course, was still complex, with lingering echoes of the past that surfaced in unexpected ways. Though I had left behind my old marriage, its presence was still woven into so many parts of my world. Old friends, familiar places, shared memories. And there was the ever-present shadow of family and friends who still didn't fully understand. Some supported me without hesitation, seeing my happiness as proof enough that I'd made the right choice. But others struggled, caught between loyalties, torn by their own sense of right and wrong. Even my parents had voiced their doubts, asking questions that pried open old wounds and reminded me of the scars I'd tried so hard to let heal. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel and I decided to visit a small art fair in a neighboring town. We strolled through stalls filled with paintings, handmade crafts, and photographs. It felt peaceful, an escape from everything else. I held his hand, feeling that sense of calm that only his presence could bring. And then as we turned a corner near a stall of vintage postcards, I saw her, Mara, an old friend from my past life, someone who had been part of my and my husband's circle for years. She noticed me instantly, her face shifting from surprise to something harder to read. I hadn't told her the details of my separation, and the sight of me with Daniel must have made everything painfully obvious. Her expression held a mixture of judgment and hurt, and it made my stomach tighten. I wasn't ready for this conversation, and yet I felt the need to confront it. Daniel squeezed my hand, understanding without words that this was something I had to face on my own. Mara, I greeted her with a cautious smile. It's been a while. She nodded, glancing at Daniel and then back at me, her gaze filled with questions. We exchanged a few pleasantries, but it wasn't long before the conversation veered into territory I'd been avoiding. I didn't expect to see you like this, she said, her tone wavering between confusion and disappointment. I mean, you and Tom, you seem so solid. It felt like a slap, even though I knew it was coming. I took a breath, the words catching in my throat. Things changed, Mara. It wasn't an easy decision, but I needed to be honest with myself. It's complicated. She looked at me, eyes filled with a sort of sadness that felt almost accusatory. I just don't understand. You two were like family to us, and then you left without any explanation. It's like you just walked away. I tried to explain, to tell her that it hadn't been as simple as walking away, that it was about rediscovering myself, about the distance that had grown between me and my husband long before Daniel came into the picture. But her gaze was unwavering, and I could feel the weight of her disappointment pressing down on me. She didn't want to understand. She wanted a clear right and wrong, a story that aligned with her beliefs about loyalty, love, and marriage. After she left, I stood there in silence, the weight of her words still lingering in the air. Daniel came up beside me, wrapping his arms around me in a way that felt like a shield. He didn't ask me what had happened or pry into my thoughts. He simply held me, letting me process the whirlwind of emotions her words had stirred up. That evening, as we lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the confrontation. I knew there would be more moments like this, that people would continue to question, to judge, to misunderstand. It was a reminder that while I had moved forward, parts of my past were still tethered to me in ways I couldn't fully control. In the quiet darkness I spoke, my voice barely a whisper. Sometimes I wonder if it'll always be like this. People looking at me, questioning, as if I've done something unforgivable. Daniel's arms tightened around me, his voice steady. You don't owe them an explanation, you know? People will always have opinions, but only you know your truth. You're allowed to make choices that make you happy, even if others don't understand. His words were simple, but they brought a sense of clarity. I realized that I had been carrying the burden of others' judgments, letting their opinions cloud my own understanding of what had happened, what I'd needed to do for my own happiness. Mara's reaction was a reminder of the parts of myself I'd outgrown, of the person I was no longer willing to be. In the days that followed, I focused on rebuilding my life, carving out a path that felt right for me. I returned to passions I'd neglected: art, writing, cooking, meals that felt like little acts of self-love. With Daniel's support, I began to see that my happiness was a journey I could shape, no longer tied to the expectations of others or the roles I'd once played. Eventually, I started reconnecting with friends who were more open-minded, people who saw my growth as something to be celebrated, rather than judged. And slowly, I began to let go of the guilt, realizing that happiness was not something I needed to apologize for. My life had taken a path I never anticipated, one filled with unexpected twists, but also profound discoveries about who I truly was and what I wanted. One morning, as Daniel and I sat on our small balcony, sipping coffee and watching the sun rise, I felt a calm settle over me, a quiet acceptance of everything I'd been through. I looked over at him, his face softened in the early light, and felt a surge of gratitude that went beyond words. "Thank you," I whispered, reaching for his hand. He looked at me, puzzled. "For what?" "For everything. For helping me see myself, for being there, even when I didn't fully understand what I needed." He smiled, squeezing my hand. "You didn't need me to show you that. You just needed to see it for yourself." And he was right. In the end, my journey hadn't been about leaving one life for another or finding someone new. It was about rediscovering myself, letting go of the expectations and limitations I'd placed on my happiness. I had finally found the courage to live a life that was truly mine, a life that felt honest, joyful, and free. As the sun rose higher, casting its warmth over everything, I felt a sense of closure, a peace that went beyond the moment. I knew there would be challenges ahead, but for the first time, I was ready to face them, knowing that I had finally found my own strength, my own happiness, and the love that I truly deserved. The weeks slipped into months, each day a step further from my old life and closer to something that felt real and alive. With each passing day, I felt a stronger connection to myself and to Daniel, as if we were creating our own world, separate from the weight of my past and the mistakes that had once held me down. But as much as I wanted to believe I'd finally put everything behind me, there were still moments, still memories that tugged at the edges of my peace, whispering reminders of the life I had left behind. One evening, I received an unexpected message from Tom, my ex-husband. I hadn't heard from him in months, and seeing his name on my phone screen startled me. There was no anger in his words, no blame, just a simple request to meet up, to talk things over. My heart skipped, torn between the urge to leave the past untouched and the strange pull of closure that I knew I hadn't truly found. I showed the message to Daniel, and he studied it carefully before looking back at me, his eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "You should go," he said gently, reaching for my hand. "If it's something you feel you need to do, I'll be here when you get back." His support meant everything to me, and with his encouragement I agreed to meet Tom the following evening. The nerves bubbled up in me as I walked to the small cafe where we'd agreed to meet. When I arrived, I saw him already seated, staring at his coffee, a familiar look of concentration on his face. Seeing him there in a place we'd been so many times before brought back a flood of memories, happy ones, hard ones, all twisted together. He looked up as I approached, a faint smile crossing his face. "It's good to see you," he said, and I could tell he meant it. There was no resentment in his eyes, just a quiet sadness, as if he was finally accepting what we both knew had been inevitable. We exchanged pleasantries at first, carefully skirting around the heart of why we were there. I could sense the questions lingering, the unspoken things he needed to say but didn't know how to begin. Finally, after a few minutes, he looked up, his gaze steady. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he started, his voice soft but earnest. "About us, about what happened. And I realized, I didn't see you. Really see you. Not the way I should have." His words hit me like a weight lifting off my shoulders. I had spent so long carrying the guilt of our separation, wondering if I was the one who had broken us beyond repair. Hearing him acknowledge his role was like finally having permission to let go, to stop holding on to the fragments of blame I'd kept for so long. "I wasn't blameless either," I replied, my voice barely a whisper. "I kept waiting for you to change, to notice, but I should have spoken up sooner. I was afraid of facing the truth, afraid that maybe we just weren't enough for each other anymore." He nodded, a sad smile playing on his lips. I think we both knew it deep down, but it was easier to keep pretending than to face what that meant. The conversation drifted from our past to the present, as we filled in the gaps of each other's lives since we'd parted. He'd thrown himself into work, just as I had known he would, trying to build a life that felt steady and controlled. And while there was no bitterness in his voice, I could sense the loneliness beneath his words, the realization that he too was still searching for something he couldn't quite find. Then he asked a question I wasn't prepared for. Do you love him? Daniel, I mean. The question caught me off guard, and for a moment I hesitated. Not because I didn't know the answer, but because admitting it felt like crossing another threshold, letting go of one chapter completely to embrace another. Yes, I answered, my voice steady. I do. I love him in ways I never expected, ways that feel honest, real. He looked away, nodding slowly, as if he had already known the answer but needed to hear it from me. I could see the acceptance in his face, the quiet resignation of someone letting go, truly letting go for the first time. As we said our goodbyes, there was a sense of finality between us, a mutual understanding that we were each moving forward in our own ways. And while there was sadness in that realization, there was also peace. For the first time since our separation, I felt a true sense of closure, as if I'd finally laid down the last of the burdens I had carried from our marriage. I returned home that night feeling lighter, as though I'd shed a part of myself that no longer fit. When I walked through the door, Daniel was waiting, his presence a steady reminder of the life I was building. I wrapped my arms around him, feeling the warmth of his embrace, and in that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Over the next few months, Daniel and I continued to grow together, deepening the connection we'd built. Life wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of doubt, insecurities that crept up unexpectedly. But we faced them together, talking through the fears and uncertainties, each conversation bringing us closer. And as we weathered these small storms, I realized that love wasn't about never facing hardships. It was about facing them together, choosing each other day after day. We began to make plans for the future, traveling to places I'd always dreamed of, talking about moving to a new city, creating a life that felt entirely ours. Every step we took felt like a reclaiming of the person I was becoming, a commitment to the love that had brought me back to myself. One evening, as we watched the sunset from our balcony, Daniel took my hand, his eyes filled with a quiet certainty. I want this, he said softly, his gaze unwavering. I want us. Whatever that looks like, whatever it takes. His words filled me with a sense of hope I hadn't felt in years, a belief that love could be steady, enduring, something I could truly rely on. In that moment, I saw my future stretched out before me, not in the form of a fairy tale or a perfect story, but as a journey of two people choosing to walk through life together, embracing the messiness and beauty of it all. Looking back on everything, I realized that my journey wasn't just about love or finding someone new. It was about learning to let go of the past, to forgive myself, and to believe that I deserved a life filled with meaning and connection. I had spent so long trying to fit into a mold, trying to live up to expectations that had nothing to do with who I truly was. And now, as I looked at Daniel, at the life we were building, I finally understood that happiness wasn't about having all the answers or creating a picture-perfect life. It was about finding someone who saw me, accepted me, and loved me for who I truly was. As the days turned into years, our lives grew richer, more fulfilling than I could have ever imagined. There were challenges, of course, but each one reminded me of the strength I had found in myself and the love that had brought me here. I knew that the journey would continue, that there would always be new lessons, new moments of growth. But for the first time, I was ready to face it all, knowing that I was no longer bound by the shadows of my past. In Daniel, I had found a partner, a friend, and a love that was as real and imperfect as life itself. And in myself, I had found the courage to embrace that love, to trust in it, and to believe that, finally, I was exactly where I was meant to be. With each passing year, our lives continued to intertwine in ways both surprising and deeply fulfilling. What began as a quiet, cautious love blossomed into a bond one hadn't anticipated, one that didn't demand constant reassurances or grand gestures to feel secure. Daniel and I built our own traditions and filled our days with simple joys. A morning coffee ritual, lazy Sunday afternoons spent exploring new places, quiet evenings when we'd cook together, letting laughter fill the spaces that used to feel empty. But as life would have it, even in the calmest waters, there were still waves to weather. After a few years, we reached a point where the question of marriage started to linger between us. I hadn't thought about marriage since my first one ended. The idea of binding myself to someone legally, of taking vows that once felt more like burdens, terrified me. Yet, in the quiet moments when Daniel and I would look at each other, I felt something I hadn't known was possible. A desire to fully commit, to choose him despite the scars of the past. One evening, as we sat on a small picnic blanket under the stars, I found myself gazing up at the night sky, thinking about all the paths that had led us here. I felt his gaze on me, and when I turned to meet it, his expression held a quiet intensity that made my heart race. "I know we don't talk about it much," he began, his voice soft, "but I want you to know that whenever you're ready, I'm here. Whether it's marriage, a home, kids, or none of that, I'm here choosing this, choosing you." His words wrapped around me, filling me with a warmth that felt steady, grounding. And in that moment, I realized I wanted to be with him in a way I hadn't allowed myself to fully acknowledge. We'd already built a life together, but something about formally taking that step, of promising each other in front of the people who mattered most, felt like a new beginning. I took a deep breath, letting go of the lingering fears, the weight of the past, and reached for his hand. "I think I'm ready," I whispered, my voice trembling but filled with certainty. "I want this. I wanna. Whatever that means, wherever it takes us." The smile that spread across his face was unlike any I'd seen before. A mix of relief, joy, and a love that I knew would be there long after the highs and lows of life. We didn't make grand announcements or set a date right away. Instead, we took our time, savoring the quiet excitement that lingered between us, like a secret only we shared. As we slowly prepared for a future together, I found myself rediscovering what love and commitment could be. We chose to hold a small ceremony, intimate and simple, surrounded by the people who had been part of our journey, those who'd seen us through the trials and the triumphs. The day felt surreal, like a moment outside of time. I wore a dress that wasn't elaborate, just elegant and comfortable, one that made me feel more myself than I ever had in my first marriage. I looked in the mirror that morning, and for the first time I felt complete, no longer defined by my past, but by the choices I had made to create a new life. Standing there across from Daniel, I felt a calm I hadn't known was possible. His vows were simple, heartfelt, filled with a sincerity that needed no embellishment. When it was my turn, I spoke from the deepest parts of my heart, letting him see all the vulnerability, all the love, that I held for him. "Thank you for loving me as I am," I whispered, holding back tears. "For seeing me, even when I didn't fully see myself. I promise to love you, to stand by you, and to keep choosing you every day for the rest of my life." The ceremony was short, the celebration quiet, but it was exactly what we wanted. A reflection of the life we'd built. A reminder of the steady, enduring love we shared. That night, as we danced together, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. The fears that had once haunted me, the questions of worthiness, the doubts that had lingered from my past, they all faded into the background, replaced by the steady pulse of joy that came from knowing I was finally, truly, where I was meant to be. Our life together unfolded with all the small, beautiful moments that make up a lifetime. We traveled, explored new cities and tucked away corners of the world, each adventure deepening our bond. We built a home that reflected us, a blend of his love for nature and my penchant for art and creativity. It was a space filled with light and laughter, with walls that held memories of quiet mornings and laughter-filled evenings, with rooms that echoed with the music of our shared life. Years passed and our love continued to evolve, weathering the inevitable challenges that life brought our way. We faced setbacks, times when the pressures of work, family, and life's uncertainties weighed on us. But through it all, we kept choosing each other, kept returning to that commitment we'd made in the quiet of our hearts so long ago. As we grew older, our dreams shifted, evolving in ways I hadn't anticipated. We spoke of starting a family, and while it wasn't an easy path, the journey brought us even closer. After several years of trying, when we finally held our child in our arms, I saw in Daniel's eyes the same love and joy I'd felt on the day of our wedding. We were no longer just partners but a family, a unit built on a foundation of trust, resilience, and a love that had withstood everything life had thrown at us. Our home became a place of laughter, filled with the sound of tiny feet running down hallways, of bedtime stories and whispered dreams. Daniel became the kind of father I always knew he would be, patient, warm. His love for our child an extension of the love he'd shown me. Watching him with our little one brought a depth to our relationship I hadn't anticipated. A new layer of gratitude for the man who had walked beside me through every chapter. In the quiet moments when our child was asleep and the house was wrapped in silence, we would sit together, reflecting on how far we'd come. Sometimes we'd laugh about the early days, about how our story had started in a place of uncertainty and confusion. Other times we'd talk about the future, about the things we still hoped to do, the dreams we hadn't yet pursued. And through it all there was a deep contentment, a shared understanding that whatever came next, we would face it together. Looking back, I realized that my journey had been as much about self-discovery as it was about love. I had learned to let go of the expectations I'd once clung to embrace the messiness and beauty of life in its rawest form. I discovered a strength within myself, a resilience I hadn't known was there. And in that discovery, I'd found a love that was genuine and lasting. In Daniel I had found not just a partner, but a friend, a confidant, someone who saw me for all that I was and loved me unconditionally. Our love was never perfect, never without its challenges, but it was real, enduring, a testament to the power of choosing each other, again and again, through every season of life. And as we grew old together, our hair silvering and our steps slowing, I knew that I had found something rare. A love that had not only survived but thrived, a life that was rich with memories, laughter, and the quiet joy of being truly seen. I knew as I looked at him that I had found my forever, a love that had weathered every storm and come out stronger, a life that had been worth every moment, every choice, every risk. In the end, I realized that my journey wasn't about finding someone to complete me, but about finding the courage to complete myself. And in doing so, I'd found a love that was true, a life that was full, and a happiness that was finally truly my own. As the years passed, my life with Daniel became a symphony of small, meaningful moments, each one a note in the melody of our shared life. Our child grew, filling our days with joy, wonder, and the occasional chaos of parenthood. Watching Daniel as a father brought a new depth to my love for him. His patience and dedication to our family only amplified everything I already cherished about him. He had become my partner in every sense, a constant source of love and strength, and each day with him felt like another step in the journey I had once feared I would never find. Our lives moved with a gentle rhythm, filled with the simple pleasures we'd come to treasure. Family dinners, vacations filled with laughter, and the quiet evenings we spent reading side by side as our child fell asleep. Our home, once just a place of refuge from our individual worlds, became a true sanctuary, alive with memories and the warmth of family. Over time, we created traditions that bound us closer, ones that felt like small anchors in the vast ocean of life. Every autumn, for example, we'd take a trip to a cabin in the mountains, a place tucked away from the busy world where we could just be together. We'd hike through the crisp air, the trees blazing in hues of red, orange, and gold, our hands intertwined as we took in the beauty of the world around us. It was during one of these autumns, surrounded by the vivid colors of the forest, that Daniel held my hand and suggested we write letters to each other, letters we'd read in another 20 years, as a way to remember who we were in this moment. We sat by the fire that night, each of us lost in thought, the sounds of crackling wood and soft breaths our only company. As I wrote, I found myself reflecting on the incredible journey that had brought us here. I wrote about my gratitude, about the strength he had shown me, the way he had lifted me up when I doubted myself. I wrote about how our love had saved me, not in the dramatic way I had once believed love would, but in a quieter, more powerful way. I wrote about the small moments that made up our life together, the laughter, the late-night conversations, the dreams we had shared and built. And as I folded the letter, sealing it away, I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that whatever the future held, we would face it together. In time, our family grew. We welcomed another child, a daughter, whose bright eyes and infectious laugh brought new joy to our lives. Watching her bond with her older sibling, seeing Daniel with our children, reminded me that love is an ever-expanding force, one that has the power to grow and change as we do. With 2 children, our home became a place of constant activity and laughter. Mornings were a chaotic dance of breakfasts and school runs, while evenings were filled with bedtime stories, whispered secrets, and little voices that filled the house with warmth. But life as it does brought its own challenges. There were days when we were stretched thin, times when the demands of work, parenting, and simply existing weighed heavily on us. We navigated illnesses, financial struggles, and the unavoidable ups and downs of raising children. There were moments of exhaustion when we'd fall into bed too tired to talk, just lying beside each other in the dark, our hands reaching out in silent solidarity. Yet, even in those hard times, I never doubted our bond. Each hardship only deepened our connection, reminding us of the commitment we had made to each other all those years ago. One of the most difficult chapters in our lives came when my mother fell ill. Her health declined rapidly, and caring for her became a central focus of my life. Daniel was there every step of the way, supporting me as I navigated the grief and responsibilities that came with watching a parent fade. He was a constant presence, shouldering the burdens of our family life when I couldn't, taking on extra responsibilities without a single complaint. I remember one night when I broke down, feeling overwhelmed by the weight of it all. He held me in his arms, whispering that we'd get through it together, that I wasn't alone. In those dark moments, I saw the true depth of his love, a love that wasn't about grand gestures or romantic words, but about unwavering support, resilience, and compassion. I had never felt so grateful, so deeply seen as I did during those days. With his help, I was able to say goodbye to my mother with a sense of peace, knowing I'd been there for her, and knowing I had a partner who would hold me through the waves of grief that followed. As our children grew into teenagers, new challenges and joys emerged. I watched them blossom, their personalities taking shape in ways that filled me with pride and sometimes brought me to tears. Daniel and I would spend evenings talking about their dreams, their futures, marveling at the people they were becoming. Our eldest became passionate about science and art, constantly exploring, always curious, while our daughter developed a love for writing, spending hours creating stories filled with wonder and imagination. Seeing their creativity, their drive, reminded me of the journey I'd taken to rediscover myself, and I hoped that our family, our life, would always be a place where they could feel free to grow into whoever they wanted to be. We made time for ourselves too, even as life grew busier. Every year on our anniversary, we'd take a weekend just for us, a tradition we'd started long ago and vowed never to break. Those weekends were filled with laughter, with memories, with a closeness that reminded us of the early days, when our love was fresh and new. We'd talk late into the night, reflecting on our journey, sharing dreams for the future. And each year as I sat across from him, I'd feel the same love I had felt at the beginning, only deeper, rooted in a lifetime of shared moments and enduring trust. When our children eventually left for college, the house felt both emptier and fuller, filled with memories of a life well lived, yet quieter in the absence of their laughter. Daniel and I found ourselves rediscovering each other in this new chapter. We spent our days traveling, exploring places we'd only dreamed of, finding joy in the world around us. Every city, every quiet village, every new landscape was an adventure, a chance to see the world through each other's eyes. As we grew older, our love settled into a kind of quiet, contented rhythm. We no longer needed words to communicate the depth of our feelings. A glance, a touch, a shared smile conveyed everything. Our lives had changed in ways I could never have predicted, each phase bringing its own beauty, its own lessons. I had come to realize that love wasn't about finding a person to complete you, but about finding someone to walk beside you as you both grew. Someone who would hold your hand through every challenge, every joy. One evening, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset, I looked over at Daniel, his hair now silvered with age, his face lined with the years we had shared. I felt a surge of gratitude, an overwhelming sense of peace, knowing that he had been the great love of my life. He looked back at me, his eyes warm, and reached for my hand, our fingers intertwining in a gesture that had become second nature. "We've had a good life, haven't we?" he whispered, his voice filled with a gentle, wistful joy. I nodded, unable to hold back the tears that filled my eyes. "The best," I replied, my heart swelling with all the memories, all the love we had built together. We sat in comfortable silence, watching the last rays of sunlight dip below the horizon, knowing that we had truly shared something rare and beautiful. In the end, our love story wasn't a fairy tale, nor was it marked by perfection. It was a journey filled with struggles, growth, and change, but also with laughter, passion, and a devotion that had endured through every season of life. I had found my happiness not in the fulfillment of some idealized notion of love, but in the simple everyday moments, in the quiet strength of a partnership that had stood the test of time. And as I sat there holding his hand, I knew that whatever came next, whether it was more years together, or the inevitable end that life would eventually bring, I had been blessed with a love that was real, one that had transformed me, and one that would live on in the memories and the lives we had touched. In the quiet twilight of our lives, I found myself cherishing every remaining moment with Daniel, every laugh line etched around his eyes, every shared cup of coffee on our porch. Time which once seemed limitless, now felt like a precious gift, one we both held close with silent gratitude. We no longer spoke about the future in terms of dreams and plans, but in the gentle assurance that whatever time remained, it would be spent together. One evening, as the seasons turned and autumn cast its golden light across our small town, Daniel and I sat watching the leaves fall, wrapped in a blanket on our porch. His hand rested warmly in mine, and we sat without words, a quiet that spoke volumes. We had shared a life full of moments that were as simple as they were profound, and we both knew we had been lucky. The years caught up with us as they do with everyone. There were hospital visits, gentle reassurances, hands held tighter than ever before. Our children visited often, filling the house with warmth and laughter, bringing with them pieces of the world outside that we had long since left behind. They would sit with us, listening to our stories they'd heard countless times, but that took on new meaning as the years passed. We shared memories, laughter, and a deep, abiding love that they carried forward in their own lives, a testament to everything Daniel and I had built together. One night, after a long day filled with family and memories, Daniel lay beside me, his breathing soft and steady. I looked over at him, a gentle peace on his face, and felt a quiet knowing settle over me. My heart swelled with a mixture of sadness and love, an understanding that our journey was coming to its close. As I watched him, I felt only gratitude for a life shared, for a love that had endured, for a partnership that had filled every corner of my heart. When the morning came, Daniel was gone, his hand still resting in mine. The sadness was vast, yet it was wrapped in a peace that softened its edges. I sat there for a long time holding his hand, letting the years of our life together pass before me, a gentle reel of memories that felt as real as if I could reach out and touch them. In the days that followed, I found myself surrounded by the love we had nurtured. Our children, our friends, the family we had created, they were all there, carrying pieces of him, keeping his memory alive. And though he was gone, he was everywhere, in the laughter of our children, in the quiet strength I felt as I faced the world without him, knowing he would always be a part of me. As I continued my life alone, I learned to find joy in the small things, in the memories of our years together, and in the peace that comes from a life well loved. Daniel had been my partner, my best friend, the great love of my life, and though he was no longer by my side, his presence was woven into every part of me. In time, I came to understand that love like ours never truly fades. It lives on in the memories we shared, in the family we built, and in the quiet moments of stillness when I could feel him with me, a gentle reminder of a life lived fully, deeply, and beautifully. And in the end, that was more than enough.